Hey, it's Joe Farrow with Geek Toolkit. In this episode, we're going to talk about things to do after you've got Home Assistant installed. In the last video, I talked about Home Assistant installs. I got you right up to the login screen. As part of that, I talked about how all of those different install types are based on what kind of person you are and what you value. For instance, if you're a person that's very technical and wants to manage your own IT, there's going to be certain install types that are right for you, and so on. In this video, it's going to be very similar, where I'm going to talk about different things that I do, and I'll explain the pros and cons, or kind of like why I do them. And from that, you'll be able to take what works for you. And then at the end, you should have a Home Assistant install setup that will be right for you and right for the things you want to do with it. Before we get started, let's talk about some of the lingo of Home Assistant so we understand the vocabulary, so we're not trying to learn that and the user interface at the same time. An integration in Home Assistant is basically like the language that you use to talk to a different device in your home. This is some of the integrations for Home Assistant, and this is the way I like to think of them. I have like a Samsung Smart TV in my house. I have Kodi Media Center. I have WLED LEDs. And so if I want Home Assistant to talk to those, I need an integration so that it knows how to speak the language and talk the talk. So to me, the integration is the communication layer, and there are 1,700 integrations as of October 2020. So you can talk to a lot of different things. An integration doesn't mean 100% functionality. For instance, Arlo makes smart cameras, but I can't actually talk to any of the video on a smart camera. I can't get that data off the Arlo. I can't get things like the temperature and humidity on the baby camera, but I can't actually get the video. So keep that in mind about integrations, is sometimes just because the integration's there, it doesn't mean everything works. A device is a physical object in your home that uses the integration to communicate with Home Assistant. So the integration is the communication layer. The device is the physical layer. It's a physical thing that gets talked to. The reason this is important is you can have multiple devices for one integration, and you often do. If you have light switches and they're using like a Z-Wave integration, you might have 10 light switches that are using one integration. For the Arlo cameras, I have 3 Arlo cameras that use that one Arlo integration, and I have a couple Samsung TVs. In the lower right, I have Veroni lamps. I did a video on these. They use the WLED integration to actually set the colors of the lamps themselves. The lower left, I have a printer. I'm going to actually deep dive on that in the UI and talk about printers and how Home Assistant talks to my printer as just an example. Entities, there's multiple entities per device. For example, on the printer device, each one would have a printing status of if it's printing or not, and then a color and black ink level. Entities are interesting because they're typically things that can be queried, so such as sensor data, temperature data, motion data, stuff like that, or they're things that can be set, such as the light brightness, the light color, and so on. My WLED, or the Veroni lamps, they have an LED color value that is an entity I can set to set them to any color I want. The Arlo baby cameras are all things I would read, but that has temperature, humidity, air quality. So there's actually quite a few entities on this one device for each device in my home. So going back to the printer example, the status that I said was an entity can have the value of either idle or printing. These are called states, and states are what you query in an automation or set in an automation. So if I was wanting to set a light to be red, I would query the entity of status on my device printer to see what the state is, and if it's printing, then go set that light color. That's the next video that I'll talk about, where we actually set up automations, but that's why I'm going through this vocabulary, so that we can speak with that lexicon basically, and everything will make sense to you. At the top of the hierarchy is the integration. This was the language that Home Assistant uses to speak to a device of that integration. The device is the physical object that uses the integration to communicate with Home Assistant. This could be like the TVs, the printers, or whatever. Under this are the entities. These are things about the device that we can either set or read. And then under each entity is a state, which is the actual current value of that entity. Do it again, but we're going to do it with real words and real examples. So the printer would be a integration that I can install to have Home Assistant talk to my printer. Hewlett-Packard printer is my physical device, my printer that's in my office that is using that integration to communicate. There are 3 things on my printer that I can query to find out about the printer, and these are my entities. And then these are the values that come back, and these are my states. Okay, I know that's a bit dry, but if you sat through that and understand it, then it makes all of the other videos and all of the other stuff about Home Assistant makes so much more sense. We can now jump into the user interface and have a lot of fun because we don't have to worry about the jargon. We can actually just see how this stuff's laid out in the actual program itself. You start at the overview page on the right hand side here. This is a Lovelace UI. It's very customizable. This rectangle here is what's called a card. This is the weather card. You can have different cards for different things. If you click on them, you get more information. These up here are called badges. I know we don't need no badges, but right now we do. This one's by default comes in. It's called the updater. The updater will show you if you have an available update to Home Assistant. It's one of the built-in badges that you get. This one here is your user badge. It says UNK because it doesn't know where I am. This is all about presence. You can actually install presence detectors or do presence for things like if I'm connected to my network, I must be home. Then you can do automations on that. Say if I am home, do this. If I leave home, maybe turn on some security cameras, stuff like that. The sun one is just exactly what you'd think. It's the sun. If it's above or below the horizon, you can do stuff like turn on lights when the sun's down. These are some defaults that you get with Home Assistant. You can remove them if you want. They're actually very useful. I don't bother me, so I leave them right there. This is the map. The map was that presence thing. Now, the presence is not only if you're home or not, it has zones. You can edit it by clicking this little pencil up here in the right upper right corner. You'll typically have the edit icon in the upper right hand corner of the UI, and you'll have the add icon in the lower right corner. So get used to that. The little add icon, you see it here, the little plus. If I want to add a zone, I can click here, give it a name. I can also edit the zones here. This is the one that if I'm getting ice cream and I'm within this range, I must be getting ice cream. If I'm in this range, going to work. I can have automations actually fire based on where I'm at. That's called geofencing or geolocation based automations. That's what the map's for. It allows you to set those zones. The logbook and the history are just different ways to view things that have happened. So I can go here and it defaults to like the last day or so. I can see that my printer went to idle. It was actually offline. I can see that the sun's gone up and down. And also this actually home one, this is actually that weather card. So it was cloudy and rainy. I live in Washington. That's just how it is. Developer tools are all about things that you would use to debug automations or find out if stuff that you installed is working. So I can see here, here's all my entities. Supervisor. Now there's two things that we can manage. We can manage devices in the house and we can manage Home Assistant itself. The Supervisor tab's where we manage Home Assistant itself. You can see here we've got a pending update. I can click on update to do the updating of the Home Assistant portion. This update here is for the operating system. This is because I'm running full Home Assistant on HAS OS. Now the thing to know here is that there's a release note link. I highly recommend reading the release notes. This thing's in beta, so they will break stuff unabashedly. Make sure you read the release notes, look at the breaking changes so that you don't get broken. The add-on store is the next thing here. It's like a store except for everything is free. It's great. You want to add stuff, you can click on it and install it. We'll do that in a second. Snapshots is their name for backups. This is like taking a snapshot of all your settings and everything. Really handy, especially before you go do that update thing. The system is going to give you an overall view of your system. It allows you to reboot it. This is used quite often. So keep in mind, you click on Supervisor, you click on the System tab up here, you go and reboot, and this is how you get your stuff rebooted. Here's your system metrics. That's also useful for obvious reasons if you want to know about your usage. You can click on the triple dots here and go to hardware and actually see the USB devices that are plugged in. This is useful too if you're trying to configure some dongles. All right, let's move on to configuration because this is where we actually configure devices and things that we care about inside of our home. The top thing on configuration, Home Assistant Cloud, this is a way to access Home Assistant remotely. We'll get into that in another video. Here we go, integrations, devices, and entities. This is what we went over in our little vocab lesson, so let's talk about it. On the integrations, we can see the integrations show right up. These are ones that were auto-discovered on my network. I also have the Internet Printing Protocol installed right here. This is what allowed my printer to show up. If I go over to devices, there's the printer that is using that integration. That's the physical device. And then if I click on entities, we can see all of my entities. And then if I look at these right here, there you go. There's the HP NV87 or 7800. This is the one that says if it's printing or not. This is the one for the ink color for black and color here. So this is what I was talking about, where you have a bunch of entities show up for your devices. Not everything ends up as a device. Entities may be other things. So you can see that the ice cream location we threw together, that actually shows up as an entity. The reason being is we can use these for automations and they show up as different things. The sun also is there. There's no physical device for the sun. Well, at least not one in my home, thankfully, but the sun shows up as an entity that we can use for automations. And we'll get into automations in the next video. One last thing I want to talk about is areas. Areas are just basically you can name and create any area, and then you can do grouping on areas, which is really helpful. If I have my Hewlett-Packard printer in my office, then boom, I can throw that in the office location. I can throw lights in there, and then I can do things like, say, turn office off and have everything in the office turn on or off. Here is another button. This is the user button, and when you click on it, this allows you to pick themes and such if you have them installed. It also allows you to turn on advanced mode right here, which will turn on some settings that are really helpful. Okay, there's 3 ways to install integrations. There's the ones that are self-discovered like this here. There's ones that can be added from the UI, which you click on the plus button here and you basically select what you want to install. And then you would just go through the install buttons here. Finally, there's a way of doing it through the config file, which we'll talk about later when we get into add-ons, but it's a bit more of an advanced way of adding things. The nice thing is being able to add things to the user interface is really handy and works for most things right now. And each release they do, they move more stuff over to the UI, which was really nice. The next thing I want to talk about is the user interface, because now that you have integrations and you know how to install them, you're going to want to know how to actually see what's going on with them. So you can see here, I know I have my Hewlett-Packard printer installed, but I don't have any cards for it. Click on this triple button here and say Edit Dashboard. Now we can actually edit this UI here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this home one alone. I'm going to create a new one, call it Printer. This is a tab basically that will be shown. And you can see here I've got Home and Printer now. Now these are called views. So if I go to the printer view, we can again edit this here. The plus sign, we know that this is how we add things. We can click the plus sign here and then we can add by cards, or we can also add by entity. I'm going to select the entity here and I'll click on this printer. What's cool about this is it'll give me options for what kind of cards, and it'll try to guess one that would work really well. Now this entity right here is if the printer's printing or idle. I'm going to go with something basic. I'm going to go with just the entity card, which just shows it like this. Now let's add something else. Let's add the ink levels. And the ink levels I think would be really cool as a gauge. So what I'm going to do is add this gauge here, and I'll add one more for the ink, for the color ink. So there you can see we've got color and black, and then we've got the idle section here. Click the close button, all of the edit buttons go away, and now I've got a nice simple tab that shows what my printer is doing and how my ink levels are. At this point, you can now go have a field day adding entities in your home and then adding user interface and make this customized to look however you want. We'll talk about theming in another video, but we can actually edit the colors and so on here as well. And then this right here, you saw this was a gauge card. They have what are called custom cards. So you can have one that maybe has multiple gauges or just an entirely different look. There's a couple other things that I think we should do before we leave. One of them is install a couple of add-ons, and then we should create a backup. So let's go to the Supervisor tab here and the add-on store. Now here's a bunch of add-ons that are available, and I'll talk about a couple that I think are useful for everyone just starting out here. This Check Home Assistant configuration is a very interesting add-on. What you do is you select it and we'll say install, and while it's installing, I'll talk about it. This add-on will actually install the next version of Home Assistant for you, and then it will find out if there's anything that would conflict before you upgrade. To use it, you simply click the start button, let it run, and then when it's done running, you can check the log over here. Now, every add-on has these 4 tabs when you've installed it. The documentation tab is super important, and I highly recommend reading through any documentation to find out how an add-on works and how to configure it. Very often when you install an add-on, you're going to want to go into the configuration portion and configure it. For this add-on, it's a little special. You actually just hit start and you'll see what happens is it installed the next version of Home Assistant. It takes a copy of the configuration, checks everything, and then I'll hit refresh here and we will see. Click on the log file here, you can see that it's completed and there was no errors found. This means I can update. Now the logs are a really important thing anyway for any add-on, because if you hit any issues with the add-on, check the log. The other thing to know about add-ons, if you're starting out here, is if you click start on an add-on and then it stops almost immediately, go check the log. Keep in mind the logs don't auto-update, so you're going to want to hit refresh and see what's going on here. Let's install another add-on that's a little bit more complex but also incredibly useful. And that one's called Samba. Samba exposes what are called file shares, and this allows you to browse the files that are on your Home Assistant server very easily. Here's the Samba share. We're going to click install. This will get the initial install, and then notice that you just have info and documentation. When it's installed, you get all 4. Okay, now that we've got it installed, it says start down here. We can go over to documentation and read through this. This will show you the configuration and talk about different aspects of the configuration and what they do, which is really handy. Once we understand that, we can click over to configuration and we can see that the default password is null. One quick note, common thing that people hit here, and I want to thank my friend Roy for explaining this one to me, that because he hit it, is if you see the term SSL in the configuration, this is for an encrypted communication to your Home Assistant from a remote source. For now, what we're doing is setting up Home Assistant to only be accessible internally to our home network. And that's kind of how I keep mine. I don't actually expose anything over SSL. So if you see the words use SSL here, you're going to want to set that to false for any of the add-ons you're doing. If you don't, what will happen is you'll typically get an error. What I've done here, since I've got the configuration, I'm going to give it a password here. Give it the password. We're going to hit save down in the lower right. Go back to info and hit start. And then we're going to see if this starts. If it were to say start here still, then I would know it had failed. But since it says stop, I can tell that it's actually going right now. I'm going to click over in the log and take a look, and everything looks like it's popped up. And there I've gone to the network share of / Home Assistant, and there's my folders. If we go to the config folder, I can see my configuration YAML right here. And this is where I would do some of the more advanced add-ons. I would actually add them in here. All right, this is great. That allows me to get those config files if something were to go wrong or if I need to edit them. And it also shows you how to install add-ons yourself. All right, now that we've done this and we've kind of walked through add-ons, we've walked through the UI, the next thing and final thing we'll do here is talk about backups. We're going to go back to Supervisor here and go to the Snapshots section. If I want to create a backup of my current configuration, I can just say if I want a full or partial, I'm going to say full. I can give it a password if I want to protect it. Simply hit create, and there you go. There's my backup for today. I can click on this initial one, and I can say I want to download it, or I actually want to restore it, which would install that backup. So it's very easy to back up to a certain level area and restore it. Really, ideally, what you'd want is to be able to back up to the cloud. So let's talk about how to do that. I use this one right here. It's called Home Assistant Google Drive Backup. It's very, very popular. It's very well done. It's by Sebastian on GitHub. I'll have a link to his repository here. He has a great description of how to install it, but just to do the walkthrough for those that like video better, what we're going to do is go to Supervisor. We're going to go to Add-on Store. We're going to say Add Repositories. Right here, if you don't have this one, you can just paste his GitHub there, click Add, and there it is. There's the Home Assistant Google Drive repository. Because when we go to the add-on store now, we go to the very bottom here, you can see there it is. And then you just install it like any other add-on. I'm going to say install. I'm going to also say show in sidebar. And remember, the sidebar is over here. So if I say show in sidebar, there it is, Snapshots. We can read the documentation. This tells us all of the fancy things that you can configure on this. I'm going to go over the configuration tab and make sure that these look okay. The use SSL, this one can bite you. This is very common in most add-ons, and what it's about is a encrypted way of accessing the add-on remotely. Since we're just starting out, I'm not going to expose my Home Assistant to the cloud or to the, I should say, to the internet. So I'm going to turn SSL off. That means that the only way I would access this is on my local home network anyway. Okay, we're going to go back and we're going to hit start here and see what happens. And we'll click on the log and hit refresh. This is a really common thing that you're going to do. You're going to hit start, you go to the log, you hit refresh, you make sure everything looks good. Okay, so we've got the UI here. There's two different ways to do a web UI. If you've got it on the sidebar here, you can click here. Also, a lot of add-ons will have an open web UI in the lower right here. You can click on this, and this will walk us through how to get started. So the first thing it wants to do is authenticate. I'm going to hand it my email address here and get the credentials. Now for me, sending credentials never works, so I'm going to copy this here, and then we will go back to the app. So let's see, on the supervisor, and basically just paste it into here. I'll click save. Okay, so now we're configured, and it's got my backups, and it knows what backups are my local ones. So in Home Assistant, I've got 3 right now, and then in Google Drive, I also have 3. And this is really nice because I can click here, and I can say if I want to restore right from the cloud. I can also install a fresh version of Home Assistant, go here, restore from the cloud. Now, the nice thing is it's going to do stuff to make sure it doesn't overflow my Google Drive by only saving a couple of them. So we look at it a little bit closer. To get to it, go to Dashboard, and then there it is, Home Assistant Google Drive Backup. And if we look at the configuration, we can see that it's going to keep 4 snapshots in Hass.io, and 4 in Google Drive. And then it's going to snapshot automatically every 3 days. That's really handy. It's going to maintain all of my backups for me every 3 days. I'll be good to go. I can change this if I want something more aggressive. And then if I click here, I can see there's a lot of settings that I can change to make it basically do what I want. That was a really fun video, and I think that will get you to the point where you can add stuff to your user interface, you can add tabs, you understand what entities and integrations are, and so on. We went through a lot in this video, and we also got everything backed up. This is a lot of the boilerplate stuff to get going with Home Assistant. From here, we can actually start doing things like automations. Now, where do you go from here? I'm going to continue this series because I've had a lot of requests for it, and I think the community needs it. It's a very hard series to do, though, because Home Assistant changes so often that things will break and become outdated very quickly. If you look on YouTube on my home automation playlist, you'll see a bunch of places you can go, from everything from setting up Z-Wave to Tuya, some of the devices you can add on. This is a 3D printed WLED project, smart mirrors, dashboards, all sorts of stuff, even home automation tablets if you want to put that together and actually have a tablet on your wall to control your home. There's also other places to go here. So if you look at the featured channels on my channels here, a number of them, including Dr. Z's, The Hookup, Pinky Wafer, these are all people that are doing amazing, amazing Home Assistant tutorials and also are incredibly technical and incredibly deeply versed on this. I want to appreciate you watching this. I hope this was helpful. If it was, please give me a thumbs up to let me know that this is more of what you want to see. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video format, if it was too fast, too slow, if explaining the verbiage at the beginning was helpful for you, or if that was just a waste of time, and I'll adjust it accordingly. All right, thanks for watching. I'm Joe Farrow with Geek Toolkit. Till next time.